Hello, and welcome to your Intro to Programming and Python lecture. Today we're going to dive a little bit deeper into how to write Python code. So let's talk a little bit about commands in Python and how we can write them and get Python to execute them. Python, as we talked about before, is an interpreted language, which means that we can run one line of Python code at a time instead of having to write an entire program, compile it, and then run it. Because of this, there are multiple ways that we can run Python code. One way would be to use command line or terminal. Terminals are probably what you think of when you see a movie of someone hacking the mainframe, where they're typing just vigorously into a black background box with green or white text. One way we can type our Python code is by doing that. In fact, I think it's really funny, but my husband calls it hacking the mainframe anytime I write code in terminal. Another option is idle, which comes with your Python download. So if you look for it in your applications, you'll probably find it. Or you can use another IDE. For instance, we are using VS Code. So let's talk a little bit about Python programs, in particular Python scripts. Scripts are just a file containing Python code. Usually Python scripts have the file extension .py, which tells the computer that this is Python code and you should read it as Python code. And scripts have a lot of different parts, so let's talk about them. While we write really simple code right now, if you look at any Python file, you might see the very top of the file having a bunch of import statements. We'll talk about this a bit more later as we actually use them, but import statements are a way of importing code that someone else wrote so that you can use it in your program. For instance, here you can see we're importing packages called scipy, numpy, pandas, random, and time. Next, your script will usually have a section for functions. Functions are things that we'll learn about later in the class, but are basically blocks of reusable code that you write once and then call again and again, so that instead of copying and pasting the same code multiple times, you just have a function that runs that code anytime you ask it to. Next, even the simple types of programs that we write have statements and expressions. Statements tell Python to do something. Expressions evaluate and then return a value. For example, the expression 2 times 2 will evaluate, it'll calculate what that answer is, and then return to us the answer, which is 4. A statement is something that tells Python what to do, but doesn't necessarily have a computation. For instance, the statement x equals 4 is just telling Python, take the value 4 and store it in the variable x. Another incredibly important part of a Python script is going to be comments. I talked a little bit in our first ever lecture that comments are really important because they help both you and other people to read your code. There's multiple ways that you can comment things in your script. The most common one that you've probably seen me do a lot is using a hashtag. If we put this hashtag symbol in front of a line, Python basically goes, oh, I can't see it. I'm not going to read it. I'm going to ignore it. And so we can use these to have comments. For instance, you can see here that we have a comment saying expression and a comment saying statement. This helps organize my code so that when you read it or when I read it, I know that 2 times 2 is the expression example and x equals 4 is the statement example. Next, we can have something called a multi-line comment. A multi-line comment basically helps us comment out a huge section of code that has multiple lines. When we use a hashtag to comment, it just comments out whatever the rest of that line is. But if we have a comment that spans multiple lines, say you're giving a really lengthy description of something, we can use 3 individual quotes at the beginning and the end of the comment, or triple quotes as we call it, in order to create a longer multi-line comment. So how do you use comments? Comments are really useful to explain what code does or explain how it does something. I would say if you're ever in doubt, comment something. I would much rather see over-commented code than no comments at all. All right, let's talk about Whitespace. Whitespace refers to things like spaces, tabs, enters that are all creating some type of organization but are not actually like individual characters, like a letter or a number. In Python, whitespace is really important, unlike a lot of other languages. Whitespace is ignored in expressions and statements. So that means that when you look at these two lines of code, these are both doing the same thing. They're taking a value, either 10 or 20, and they're putting it in a variable x. Even though they have different numbers of whitespace, here there's a bunch of spaces on both the left and the right of the equal sign, Python will ignore all of the whitespace and just look at the characters. Sometimes whitespace is important though and can affect what you're doing. For instance, let's look at these two lines here. Here you can see that we have basically the same symbols. The only difference is the amount of whitespace. Unlike this example though, where these two things do the same operation, these two lines won't. That's because when you have things that are important to be together, like the less than or equal to operator, which checks if numbers are less than or equal to a number, these need to be together. We can't separate them with whitespace. Similarly, we couldn't separate the 1 and the 0 and 10 with a bunch of whitespace. Next, another way that we use whitespace that we'll learn in a little bit is indentation. Indentation helps us organize code by telling Python which lines of code go with which other lines of code. For instance, here we have something called a for loop. This basically says for each number, for I in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, print the number. Because this line that says print is indented, meaning it has 2 to 4 spaces under the line above it, it tells Python that this code goes with the for loop. We'll talk more about this syntax when we get to things like loops that use indentation. Just remember, Python uses things like indentation and whitespace in order to read the program and figure out what it's doing. So whatever you do with whitespace, just make sure that you're consistent. Another thing that a lot of programmers will tell you is when you're adding whitespace to your program, use spaces, not tabs. Now, I don't have very strong feelings in the tabs versus spaces war. Other Chapman faculty do. And my friend, David Robinson, did do an analysis that looked at data indicating that it's possible that software developers who use spaces instead of tabs actually make more money. So do with that information what you will. All right, enough of whitespace. Let's talk about tokens. Tokens are basically values that have a special meaning to Python. For instance, we have keywords like if, else, list. These keywords tell Python to do something particular. We also have operators. Operators like plus, minus, multiply, etc. All of these are special characters that mean something and basically tell Python to do a specific operation, like add two things together. Next, we have punctuation and delimiters like parentheses, square brackets, the hashtags, colons, semicolons. These are all things that help organize our code and help Python know what's going on. And last but not least, we have literals. Literals are values that, again, mean something specific to Python. For instance, 123 means the number 123. And the word true with a capital T means that something is true, which is a Boolean value as opposed to false. Because these words mean something particular to Python, we can only use them in the way Python expects us to. Which brings us to variables. Variables are basically containers that store information for us. For instance, if I want to store the number 4 because that's how many corgis I want, I can put the number 4 into the variable corgis. If I later decide, 4 is a little bit too much, I only want 3 corgis, I can ask Python to replace that 4 in the corgis container with 3. Let's talk a little bit about naming conventions. When we create variables, we have to come up with a name for them. For instance, I came up with the name corgi for my variable that stores the number of corgis that I would like. This relates a little bit to the tokens that we talked about because, for example, we can't use tokens as variable names. If we tried to call a variable true with a capital T, Python would go, what are you doing? True means something specific. You can't use it as a variable name. And you can see over in the don't column, that's what's happening here. All three of these are invalid names for variables. For for and, it's because these are tokens. The words for and mean something particular to Python, and so we can't use them as variable names. We also cannot start variable names with numbers. So this variable name 123 bugs wouldn't be a valid variable name. All right, let's talk about things you should do when naming your variables. One thing you should do is start your variable name with a letter or an underscore. But actually, in real life, we won't typically start our variable names with underscores because, as you'll see as you write more and more Python, starting variables with underscores usually means something specific to developers, so we try and stay away from that. So typically, you're going to start your variable names with a letter. Our variable names can have pretty much any length we want. Obviously, remember that you have to type out this variable name at any time you want to use it, but using long descriptive variable names like number of corgis is going to be something that will help you have more readable programs. Remember, it's important that both you and other people are going to be able to read your programs. And if describing a variable in its variable name is going to help you do that, please do. Last but not least, Python is case sensitive, which means if you have two variables that have the same name, like Chelsea, but one has all lowercase and one has an uppercase C, Python believes those are two completely separate variables. So make sure that if you ever have errors or if you're ever having trouble with your variable names, that you're using consistent capitalization. As you write more and more Python and code that other people will end up using or reading, you may want to be careful about general naming conventions that the Python community has come up with. Here, I've linked a website that lists some of those conventions, which you should go check out. The TLDR of this section is basically do what you want when naming your variables as long as it's allowed, like you can't start with numbers or anything, but make sure your variables are clear. Trust me, I know the temptation of calling every variable x or xx or x1 or d or something like that. But the more descriptive your variable names are, the more readable your code will be. Also, as you're naming variables specifically for this class, make sure you make my life easier when I am grading your code. Having variable names that make sense within the context of your code are going to be really important and really helpful when I'm grading. All right, now we know how to name variables. Let's talk about how to create them. Unlike other programming languages, if you've used them, in Python, variables are created the first time they're used. So the most common way we'll create a variable is by saying the name of that variable, for instance, Chelsea underscore is underscore the underscore best, and then using an equal sign, and on the right-hand side of the equal sign, saying the value we want to store in that variable. Remember, variables are just containers to store values. The right-hand side of an assignment operation like this will say what to put in the variable, and the left-hand side will say what to call that variable. When we do variable assignment, we use a single equal sign operator. That does assignment. And we always go from right to left in the sense that we put what's on the right-hand side of the equal sign into the variable that's on the left-hand side. This means, for instance, that this line is creating a variable called Chelsea is the best and setting it equal to or assigning the value true to that variable. We can also reassign variables. So you can see here on line 2, the variable Chelsea is the best already existed, but now we are reassigning it a value of false. Maybe I did something you hated, so instead of Chelsea is the best being true, you've now set it to false. Because we do this right to left, we put what's in the right in the variable on the left, this last line is not a valid line of Python code. Whatever is on the left-hand side of your equal sign when doing assignment must be a variable name. Here, it's not. It's a Boolean, a true value. If you run this, Python will yell at you and tell you that you can't do that. This can feel a little confusing at first because when we read this line like it's kind of English, this to us says, oh, true is equal to the value of Chelsea is the best. Maybe to you that seems like we're trying to set the variable Chelsea is the best back equal to true. But in Python, because we take what's in the right and put it in what's on the left, this is not valid Python code. Remember, the left-hand side of an assignment must always be a variable. Here are some more examples of things that we should not do with assignment. First, we should not have anything on the left-hand side that is not a variable, like we just went over before. Second, and kind of related to that, if you look at line 4, this sort of makes sense. This looks like an algebra operation that you might do. You say some variable plus 1 equals 2, solve for the variable. But in Python, we cannot do this. The only thing that can be on the left-hand side of our assignment operation is a variable. Do not include extra things like an operation of plus 1. And last but not least, don't try to assign variables inside another function, like a print statement. If we said print x equals 4, you may think that that's creating a variable called x and putting the number 4 in it, but it's not. So make sure that when you're creating variables, you have them on their own line. All right, so before we go, let's go ahead and create a couple of variables together. So I'm going to, like I talked about in an example earlier, create a variable called corgis. And I'm gonna set it equal to 4 because I would like 4 corgis. I cannot do the same assignment by saying 4 equals corgis. Why not? Because the thing on the left-hand side of the assignment or equal sign operator must be a variable. Here it is instead a number, 4. Relatedly, we can't have variables that start with numbers anyway. So even if I said 4 corgis equals 4, Python will not accept that as a variable name because it starts with a number. I can, however, say corgis underscore 4 equals 4 or something like that. As long as our variable names start with a letter, we can use things like numbers or special characters like underscores in our variable names. By the way, when talking about variable names, you may hear people say things like snake case or camel case. That just refers to when you have a variable name that's basically multiple words, how do you distinguish between those words? So let's say I have a variable called number of corgis. I could make that just number of corgis, but that can be kind of hard to read because there's nothing distinguishing between the words in this variable name. So for example, some people use snake case, which means using underscores between words like number of corgis equals 4. Other times people use something called camel case, which would be number of corgis. Camel case basically capitalizes the first letter of every word but the first word in order to distinguish the difference between the words and just make our variable names easier to use. Just remember that Python is case sensitive, so if you're using something like this, don't think that this variable is equal to this one. These are two different variables to Python because they have different capitalizations. We also, remember, can't use keywords. So I can't use the word for as a variable, but I can use the word for as part of a variable name. So for instance, I can say for Professor Parlett and say hello. So you can use keywords if they're part of a longer word, but you cannot use keywords alone. Remember that when creating variables, we also need to make sure that what is on the left-hand side is only a variable. So for instance, if I say x equals 1, and then on the next line I say x plus 1 equals 3, this is not a valid line of code because what's on the left-hand side of the assignment operator is not a variable alone. Remember, left-hand side, only a variable. We take whatever is on the right-hand side and put it into the variable. So while this is not valid Python, this is. We can have operations on the right-hand side of the assignment, but not on the left-hand side. All right, that's all I have for you. I will see you next time.